Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly Sunday school lesson. I am Elder Latanya Milliken of the All Nations Church in Oakland, California, and this is lesson 2 in our spring quarter. The date of the lesson is March the 13th, 2022, and we are picking up from last week, 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, the 17th through the 31st verse. Our subject today is true wisdom, and before we get started, I want to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe so that we can get the gospel out to as many as we can. Also, we understand that there is a nation that's under attack at this time, and we want to stand with them in prayer. So please do your part. Say a prayer for our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine, that this matter will resolve itself. And we pray for their safety. And there is evil in this world. There is evil in this world. May not be in your neighborhood, may not be in your home, it may not be near you, but you must understand there is evil in this world. And so that's why, one of the reasons why we continue to pray and we stand on the side of right. Okay, I'm not going to preach today, so let me just put that aside and just remember, keep them in prayer. Also, I promised that I would share more about me. I also shared with you last week that I was selected for a panel at work for Women's History Month. I was selected as a successful manager, and I don't see myself successful, but I humbly accept it because I feel like I have so much more work to do, and I set the bar high. But thank you for the opportunity, and I just want to just say that I was humble and appreciative for the invitation, and I got an opportunity to share how I do ministry every day of my life, how I do it at work, and the importance of ministry in our lives. And I appreciate that I could come to work and be my authentic self. I was asked a question. One of the questions of the many questions that I was asked was the men in my life. What men in my life influenced me personally and professionally? And I talked about one boss that always pushed me out of my comfort zone. He would always push me out of my comfort zone. He'd say, I need you to do this. And I would say, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. And he'd say, yes, you can. And I would do it. And I would just excel. And so he would continue to do that, pushing me out of my comfort zone. And so I thank you, Scott, for pushing me out of my comfort zone so that I could fly and I could soar and I could learn and that I could grow. So I encourage the women on that was a part of this event to accept feedback about yourself and to allow people to see in you what you don't see in yourself, and allow people to push you out of your comfort zone. If you don't get out of the nest, you will never fly. And one other thing I was able to share with the attendees, how my father influenced my life and how he was influential in the confidence that I have, and how he did not hold my gender against me or put me in a box because I was a female. He had all girls. He taught us the same, and I was the one that was called to ministry and followed in his footsteps. And because he was a well-respected pastor and member of the community, I stand on his shoulders. And so I talked about how he was influential in my life, and how he was my cheerleader, and how he gave me liberty, and it was just amazing. And so I'm grateful that God chose a nobody like me to carry his word and to carry his gospel and to love to do ministry on a daily. And so one day I'm going to share with you on how I was called to ministry. For those of you who God is the Holy Spirit is nudging you, or God is calling you and you don't know what that's like, or you don't know, I will share with you my journey so that I can hopefully help you accept your calling to ministry. And so let's get to our Sunday school lesson, because the time is just really flying by. We're going to go and we're going to talk about last week, Paul is writing a letter to the Corinthian church because there was some issues. There was surfacing there. Of course, we talked in detail last week how he learned about it. But what was happening in the church of Corinth, some believed that they were superior to others because they had the gift of speaking tongues. Others gave those who ate meat a hard time. They abhorred them. They would scorn them. Others that were well-to-do members were getting drunk at the love feast, or the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, or what we call communion. Theirs was a little bit different. They would bring meals and then they would eat, but the well-to-do would get drunk and they would eat up all the food, wouldn't save no food for the poor. I tell you, it was something. And then they developed these cliques. They began to develop the cliques, is what we talked about last week, and they would choose the leader, their leaders, and the leaders that they thought was the best, better than the rest. And so all of this was happening in the church, and so we're going to pick up in the verse 17, first chapter of Corinthians, First chapter, the 17th verse. I hope you have your favorite translation. And we're going to read a little bit. I'm going to read from the Way. But right before we get started, in the 16th chapter, Paul was talking about baptism, and that he was happy that he had not baptized many people in Corinth, at the church at Corinth, and because he was more focused, and he was not downplaying baptism. His ministry, however, was about the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the power and the true wisdom of the cross. And even though Paul was an ex-Pharisee, he knew the Old Testament law. He had a teacher, the best teacher, Gamaliel. So he could speak. He could speak eloquently and had fine words and understood the law, but he had been converted, and he understood that speaking eloquently was not going to save anyone. He wanted to not dilute or distract from the power of the cross. He wanted to preach the gospel so that people would be saved, because he understood that at one point he was a persecutor of the church. But now that he was converted, he understood the power of grace. And so Paul helped us to understand, and wanted the church at Corinth to understand, that baptism is an act that followed salvation. It was not one that produced salvation. In other words, the gospel, hearing the gospel, accepting Jesus Christ brings salvation. And then after you accept and become saved, then the final act would be baptism. Baptism was not something that was going to save you. It was just an act after salvation. In other words, if you had an unbeliever and you baptized him, he was still an unbeliever, because baptized was not going to save him. So let's go to our reading real quick. We're going to pick up at the 17th verse. We're going to read a little bit. I'm going to paraphrase, as I typically do when I feel led to pause and to share. Verse 17. For Christ didn't send me to baptize. This is Paul talking. But to preach the good news, and not with clever speech, for the fear that the cross of Christ would lose its power. Okay. Verse 18, the message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction. But those who are being saved know it is the very power of God, as the scriptures say. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and discard the intelligence of the intelligent. Verse 20. So where does this leave the philosophers, the scholars, and the world's brilliant debaters? God has made the wisdom of this world look foolish. Since God, in his wisdom, saw to it that the world would never know him through human wisdom, he has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. It is foolish to the Jews. So salvation is foolish to the Jews, who ask for signs from heaven. And even though Christ gave them signs from heaven, they still did not believe. And we'll talk about that. And it was foolish to the Greeks, who seek human wisdom. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are often offended and the Gentiles say it is nonsense. I'm going to pause right there. So what Paul is saying is the Jews looked for a sign, and they looked for a savior or a Messiah who was going to be a political leader, who was going to deliver them or overthrow the Roman government. And they were not looking for someone who was meek, who was going to suffer and die like Jesus died on the cross, because the cross to them was a stumbling block. The death on the cross was humiliating, and we went through that last quarter. It was humiliating and embarrassing to them, so they rejected. And then the Greeks, they were looking for someone who was going to be eloquent. And Jesus came with simplicity. Verse 24, let's pick up at verse 24 and we'll talk more. But those who are called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. The foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans. We will never, as humans, understand the mind of God. We will never be wiser than God. In fact, we are fallen humanity. We were lost and didn't know we were lost. We were sinners and didn't know we were sinners. We needed salvation and didn't know we needed salvation. We learned that. If you've been on this journey with me when we covered the book of Romans. And God's weakness, still in verse 25, is stronger than the greatest of human strength. But so when man did not accept God, wait, I got to read this part. Hold on, I'm going to stop right here. This is the Sunday school lesson, the writer of the Sunday school lesson. Said it very, very well. But why does God insist on using such foolishness as a means of his salvation? Okay, so the preaching of the gospel is our way to salvation. The dying on the cross, the humbling and awful way that Jesus died on the cross. Right? We talked about that in our last quarter. We had a wonderful time talking about the death on the cross, how humiliating it was, how embarrassing it was, how shameful it was. All of these things God put into place for humanity. He used the foolishness. He used things that we don't accept to accomplish his plan of salvation. Are you following me today? Okay. Because let me start all over, okay? But why does God insist on using such foolishness as a means of his salvation? That is the question. The answer, because in its arrogant wisdom, in talking about the world, in the world's arrogant wisdom, it denied God's existence, his creatorship, his sovereignty, and thereby his absolute right to be glorified and worshiped by his creation. So when we did not accept God, when we thought of what we wanted to think of and believe what we wanted to believe, and did not accept God as our creator and as the divine sovereignty, and we denied him even today his glory and his worship because he is the creator. Since the world sees itself as too wise to acknowledge him, God determined in his justice to use what the world calls nonsense to accomplish his salvation. Interested? Noodle on that. That is amazing. And then Paul goes on to share that he did not even use the wealthy in that day or the wise, because many of the church at Corinth were not wise. They were not wealthy, but God had called them. I'll read it real quick. It's a good lesson. I will pick up at verse 28. Oh no, I'll read verse 27. No, I'll read verse 26. No, we're at verse 26. I'm sorry. Or did I read verse 25? Oh my God. I'll just start at 25. The foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest human strength. I think I read that. Remember, verse 26, dear brothers and sisters, that a few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful, or wealthy. In other words, okay, I'll just put it, you wasn't all that, okay? When God called you, and I wasn't all that when he called me. Instead, God chose the things of the world, considers foolish in order to shame. Come on, this is the point right here. This is the point of our lesson. God chooses things the world consider foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. You will never say you saved yourself. You can never take the credit that God has for what God has done. Therefore, I'm going straight to 31. Therefore, as the scriptures say, if you want to boast, boast only about the Lord, because you can't boast in what you've done. You can only boast in what God has done. And so there's no boasting. God used ordinary people to do extraordinary things. So let me get to my conclusion real quick. And the aim of the lesson is to note the sharp contrast between God's wisdom and the purported sophistication of the world. The principle is to understand that God's wisdom in the gospel is foolishness in the eyes of the world, but that the worldly wisdom is powerless to save anyone. The world's wisdom will not save anyone. The application is to devote ourselves to the godly wisdom of the saving gospel rather than become obsessed with gaining mere worldly sophistication, which leads to pride and can save no one. Our next week's lesson. Do I have time to read this conclusion? I know it's going to wrap it up really quick. Let me just read the conclusion really quick. Thank you. The wisdom of this world cannot save anyone from God's righteous wrath and judgment against sin. But we also need to keep in mind that since we all live in this sin-cursed world, the pursuit of secular knowledge can be useful in some ways. We all need such knowledge to function in the world, and to some extent, it reveals the wonder and the beauty of what God has created. I agree. We must understand the world in order to communicate effectively with it. But we depend on God's power, not our ability to win arguments. There is indeed a stark contrast between the saving wisdom found in the gospel of Jesus Christ and the secular knowledge and sophistication valued by human society generally. Worldly wisdom focuses on material success and earthly concerns, and it tends to engender pride, arrogance, and rivalry. The gospel focuses on spiritual, heavenly concerns, especially the salvation of sinners and service to others. That's a good conclusion. I'm wrapping this lesson up. Next week, so I can get you ready for next week. Next week's lesson focuses on Jesus Christ as our only trustworthy foundation of our lives. Be prepared by reading 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, and we're highlighting the 10th through the 23rd verse. And so I hope you enjoyed our lesson, had some very interesting points. Again, this is just a high-level view. Read your Sunday school lesson and comment on what you learned from it. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. Comment on the comments. Until next week, pray for the people. Pray for our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine. And read your lesson. Read. And until next week, God bless. Bye-bye.